of Hidden Treasures, celebrating Jewish archives in Britain. I'm Marie van der Zyl, the President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Hidden Treasures is an initiative of the Board of Deputies, the representative body of the Jewish community, and we're very pleased to be here tonight. We're celebrating the archives throughout the country, and that will tell our story. The Board of Deputies has a long history itself. It has been going since 1760. This year we celebrate our 260th anniversary, when 7 Sephardi deputados, otherwise known as representatives, petitioned King George III on his accession to the throne. I haven't, of course, been the president since 1760, although it does sometimes feel like that. The Board of Deputies is a central body in the history and the current life of Jews in the country. Our own records are held at the London Metropolitan Archives and the Wiener Library. I'm delighted that the director of the Wiener Library, Toby Simpson, is one of our speakers this evening. The Wiener Library tells the story of many Jews in this country, including mine. My grandfather, Max Lustmann, came to this country from Düsseldorf in February 1939, and he remembered experiencing Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass there. I'm very excited and deeply proud that the Board of Deputies has launched this project and delighted to be involved this evening. It means a lot to me personally. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over the Archives and Heritage Manager of the Board of Deputies to Dawn Waterman, who has been the absolute driving force behind this project. So well done, Dawn. Thank you, because this really is a groundbreaking project. Thank you for all your work, bringing this to fruition. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. As Marie says, we're delighted to be launching Hidden Treasures today. The project showcases and celebrates archive collections across the UK, which hold material related to Jews and their experiences in Britain. Today we're featuring just 3 of them: the West Yorkshire Archives Service, the National Archives, and the Wiener Holocaust Library. At the Board of Deputies, I'm responsible for the board's own archives, the majority of which, as Marie said, are held at the fabulous London Metropolitan Archives in Farringdon, London. It's there that you'll find the first minute books of the Board of Deputies, which were written in Portuguese in the 1760s. The new Hidden Treasures website, which I really urge you to take a look at, and which can be found at www.celebratingjewishArchives.org, is a portal to nearly 30 diverse collections held by national and local government institutions. It also includes special collections at universities such as Southampton, Leeds and UCL. There are also archives held by Jewish-oriented organisations, the Jewish History Association of South Wales, the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre, Sephardi Voices UK, and of course the Jewish Chronicle newspaper. Some are large collections, others are quite small, but they're all fascinating. New archives are joining the project all the time. So if you work for an organisation or a community group with an archive that relates to the history of Jews in Britain, do get in touch. We'd love to feature you in Hidden Treasures. I know that there's a tremendous interest in family history. Marie's mentioned her own, and many of the archives we feature are invaluable to people tracing their family history. But the story of Jews in Britain isn't just about the past. We also feature a COVID-19 archive that we're building ourselves right now. We're collecting digital material showing how the Jewish community has been responding to the pandemic. We've got a synagogue prayer, a refuah shalema, said for the recovery of Boris Johnson when he was in hospital. A love your neighbour as yourself card, offering assistance to vulnerable neighbours. And a leaflet from Salford City Council in both English and Yiddish, explaining in very specific detail what the prohibition on meeting in groups would mean for its strictly Orthodox residents. We'd be delighted to receive more material from you. Our plans for events at the archives have had to be put on hold for the time being, but we'll be having more online events like today's. So do stay in touch and join us again. Now over to Gillian Merrin, the Chief Executive of the Board of Deputies.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you, Marie, for introducing this very special evening. I have the pleasure of introducing the panel who are going to talk to us about some of the treasures from the archives featured in our new project, Hidden Treasures. I also would like to, at the start, thank our very generous media partner and supporter of the Jewish Chronicle, whose own archive is a delight to behold in itself. Each of our panellists will tell of treasures that we'll see this evening. Within that, a story about Jews in this country, ranging from 1277 to the 1930s and beyond, from Colchester to Yorkshire via London. So I'm delighted to introduce our panellists. First of all, we have Nigel Grizzard, the Yorkshire Jewish researcher, historian and tour guide. He'll be well known to those of you who are watching in Leeds and Bradford. And Nigel is going to talk about our first treasure. It's a charming photo of workers at Burton's, the menswear company, who are seen enjoying a perk provided by their employer in the 1930s. For myself, I was involved in trade unions in a previous career, and so I'm particularly interested in this treasure. And it comes from the West Yorkshire archives. Secondly, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Sean Cunningham from the National Archives. This is the archive which tells the national story of Britain and the Jewish experience, and the Jewish experience is an important part of that. Sean's particular area of expertise is medieval records, and as a member myself of the historic Lincolnshire Jewish community, where we're very aware of our medieval history, not all of it at all pleasant, I will be absolutely fascinated to hear what Sean has to say. I would now like to turn to the fact that Sean will be talking about, as I say, our second treasure, and that will be, and this is an interesting way of putting it, a medieval doodle on a legal document from 1277, which is, of course, before the Jews were expelled from England. Our third panellist, I'm delighted to welcome, is Dr. Toby Simpson from the Wiener Holocaust Library, which will be well known to many of us. He's going to be talking about an extraordinary board game which reflects the atmosphere in 1930s Germany. And he's going to be saying something about another aspect of the Wiener Library's work, which I feel will be of interest to you and which Marie has already mentioned, and that is their work in helping people to trace their family history. After the panellists have made their short presentations, there will be a chance for them to answer questions from you, our audience, who we thank for joining us this evening. And you're watching live on social media, so do feel free to use your chat button to submit a question, which I will then be able to put to our panellists. So first up, over to Nigel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's nice to have such a warm welcome from Gillian. I'm talking about a photo from the archives, from West Yorkshire Archives. If we can have the photo up, please. And it shows the sunroom in the 1930s at Montague Burton's factory in Hudson Road, Leeds. So the first and most important question is, who was Sir Montague Burton? What was his story? And perhaps most important, what can we learn from his legacy today? But first, a bit of history. West Yorkshire used to be textile manufacturing heartland of the UK. Leeds was a men's clothing, Bradford was wool, Halifax was carpets, Huddersfield was high quality cloth and engineering, especially for textile machinery. And in Batley and Dewsbury, they were green towns. They were for shoddy, the recycling of rags. And as we know, the Jews come mainly to Leeds, and it was a very good partnership. Jews brought with them tailoring skills, and Leeds was the expanding centre of the UK's men's clothing industry. And production had moved from one individual making an item, a whole suit, to a factory system with the division of labour, where workers did an individual task in the factory. And then along comes Sir Montague Burton. Born Moshe David Osinski in Kovno-Gubernur, the Kovno province in Lithuania in 1885, he comes to the UK in 1900, aged only 15, along with thousands of other Jews. In fact, he opens his first shop in Chesterfield in 1904, and his wife, Lady Sophia, later on, comes from the neighbouring town of Worksop, where there once was a Jewish community. And when Sir Montague's naturalised in 1910, he's then known as Maurice Burton, and he gives an address in Sheffield, but he actually calls his shops Montague Burton. He builds up a chain of men's clothing shops, and by 1919 has 40 shops, and in 1921 acquires the land at Hudson Road, Leeds, where he builds his huge factory. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is a picture that I took a few days ago. The factory still exists. It is absolutely enormous, and over 10,500 people work there. It's the largest clothing factory in the world. And the original photo we showed was of the sunroom, and this was where Burton, who was a factory owner, was very conscious of looking after his workers, allowed staff to have all sorts of health facilities. There was also a doctor, a dentist, a nurse, all on site, and it was a complete place where staff were looked after. As you can see, it's a huge factory. It's in Harehalls in Leeds, and only when you visit it can you get an idea of, to really realise how enormous it was. Now, I put on the Leeds Jewish Facebook page a little bit about Burton's, and a tremendous number of people in 3 days from the Leeds Jewish community came back to me and told me how they'd worked there. Today, it's still used, but not for manufacturing. It's a clothing depot for Arcadia and a centre for English as a second language and more small workplaces. And Burton wasn't the only clothing manufacturers in Leeds. There were many others, large and small. And the large players such as Burton were key players in the UK clothing industry. It's estimated he produced 25% of the suits made in Britain. He built a huge empire, was knighted in 1931, and dies in 1952, aged 67. So what was his legacy? And if we move on and look through the slides, you can see he was Burton, the tailor of taste. And if we look to the next slide, you can see these were women working in this enormous factory. From an employment perspective, he built a huge manufacturing and retail empire. He gave the opportunity of working in a large factory to many first-generation Jews in Leeds, and they became part of a Jewish industrial proletariat. He was a very generous funder of many institutions. He funded professorships at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he funded charities and Jewish projects in Yorkshire. And his legacy lives on in the Jewish Museum in London. It's Raymond Burton House, named after one of his children, and some of his other children were key arts funders in Yorkshire. Now, I arrived in Leeds in 1976. I came from Redbridge. I came when the tailoring industry was still functioning, and the next decade saw the decline as manufacturing was shipped overseas. When I now take young Jews around the former tailoring areas, it isn't even a memory. It's too far removed from their families. But most interestingly, during the PPE crisis in April and May of this year, the subject of the clothing industry was resurrected. I go to an online morning service of the United Hebrew Congregation, and in the chat, one of the former clothing manufacturers, now in his 90s, lamented with a former colleague how they could have turned their factories into production centres for PPE. And rather than send RAF planes to Turkey and China, they could have made all the garments that were required in Leeds. So to this picture of the women working in the factory, it harks back to a previous era when Leeds and the North was a manufacturing base. The last few months have taught us many lessons, and perhaps the most important one is that we need as a country to restore our manufacturing base rather than be hostage to overseas suppliers. This is a sentiment Montague Burton would have agreed with. If we can go on for the next two pictures, please. This is on the factory. It says Montague Burton, the tailor of taste. Making good quality made-to-measure suits for a week's wages, Burton created a mass market. This Hudson Road headquarters began in 1921. It's by far the largest clothing factory in the world, eventually employing 10,500 people. And the final slide, please. This is a picture of Dress You, one of many of Burton's shops. And if you used to look at the bottom of the shop, there was often a plaque saying that it had been unveiled by his wife, Lady Sophia, or another of the family. And the final slide, have we got? And this is very interesting because Montague Burton died in 1952. He was buried in Leeds, but he always wanted to be buried in Harrogate, where he lived. And in 1964, there was a Jewish cemetery opened in Harrogate, and both he and his wife, Lady Sophia, were reinterred from the Jewish cemetery, taken out to the Jewish cemetery in Leeds, and they were the first people buried in Harrogate. This was Sir Montague Burton, a great man, a great industrialist, a great Jew and a great Englishman, one we must remember with great enjoyment and great pride. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nigel. It's fascinating. I love the strapline, tailor of taste. Indeed so. And as you rightly said, the work that they did in those factories changed people's lives in so many ways. So thank you very much for sharing your treasure. So I'm now going to pass to Sean. Please introduce your treasure, Sean.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm Sean Cunningham from the National Archives, and I'm going to talk about why the government's documents are important in finding hidden stories for this great project. This might seem boring and bureaucratic, but government departments over the past 1,000 years have swept up all kinds of valuable personal information about people and communities. And focusing on the medieval period reveals a vibrant but increasingly difficult time for Jewish communities in England. Details and awareness of this period are often hidden because of the patchiness of the sources and the difficulty in interpreting them. Yet there are striking parallels with more modern times in what the archives can tell us about the stories of the Jews in England before 1290. As the government's archives, the National Archives also holds many documents from the 19th and 20th centuries that are helpful in exploring more recent histories. And hopefully there'll be time to talk about some of those in the discussion later. So the further back we go, the more the history of how this country was run is linked to the people who represented what the king and his advisors wanted to do. So that's the nobles, sheriffs, bishops, justices, and their clerks. And they make the king's policies work in the counties. And although the records are those of government, the men who created them often saw them as their personal papers. There wasn't such a strong distinction between official and personal paperwork. And this emerges in the first document, the treasure that I want to talk about, which is concerning Aaron of Colchester in 1277. So a court in Colchester heard a case of a gang of Christian and Jewish boys accused at a court of killing the king's deer in the Essex forest. Among them were Isaac and Samuel, sons of Aaron of Colchester. Aaron seems to have intervened to support his son, and that resulted in the clerk caricaturing him as Aaron's son of the devil in this marginal sketch. The picture is important because it's an early English image of the badge of shame, the piece of yellow taffeta, 6 fingers long and 3 broad, cut to represent the shape of the tabula that bore the 10 Commandments. The badge was established at the Pope's Council in 1215, and by 1277 had to be worn by all English Jews over the age of 7. Its inclusion in Aaron's portrait emphasized that the clerk thought he had behaved outrageously and that his offensiveness should be recorded forever on the record of the case. And it's important in several other ways too. It confirms how the official record could unexpectedly reveal snapshots of everyday life and the difficulties Jewish people faced after the statutes of 1253 and 1275 regulated their lives much more stringently. Aaron's sticking up for the rights of his sons at their trial clearly irritated this clerk, yet it also hints at the practicalities of life in towns, where despite the oppressive rules, Jewish and Christian people continue to mix and to interact, particularly perhaps the younger generations. Above all, the clerk's sketch shows the kind of ingrained hostility which in less than 15 years would bring about the expulsion of all remaining Jews from England. These themes are shown on the other slides I want to briefly discuss as well. So the next one reaches right back towards the Norman conquest in 1066. It's a confirmation by King John in 1201 of the liberties given to the Jews of London by Henry I before 1135. It includes lots of information about oath-taking, rights at law, travel and trade, and the Jewish community was collectively the king's property by this definition. So something that offered royal protection, but also allowed for heavy exploitation. And this grant cost the Jews 4,000 marks in 1201, and heavy taxation and loans became a burden for English Jews for almost the next 200 years. In the early part of the 13th century, despite earlier persecution over money lending and the horrifying massacres at London and York in 1189 to 90, there is some evidence of good relationships between the communities. This next slide shows Mirabelle of Gloucester, a more positive sketch than that of Arran. Mirabelle persuaded the powerful knight William Marshal to honour King John's grant of the quittances of her husband's debts, and the image appears in a role of gifts offered for royal favour, so she was able to influence the highest men in the country. The next image is of a contract for lease of property in London. It's probably from the 1220s, and the Hebrew script sewn onto the Latin document at the bottom left shows a normal level of business relations in the larger cities where Jewish populations were the greatest. Here, Aaron, son of Abraham, is releasing his own rights in a text that he wrote himself. Such skill and innovation drove financial developments like the system of loans and mortgages, and was important also in helping to fund the royal household at the time. It was these business interests and the success in which they were managed that increased anger towards Jewish people, something also obvious in the hostile allegations of ritual murder and kidnapping, and that plagued much of this century. The state's response was the first Statute of the Jews in 1253. And this act set new rules about the wearing of badges, a ban on new synagogues being built, segregation between communities, and a concentration of Jewish people into the larger cities. Records of debts to Jewish merchants were also targeted in the Civil War of the 1260s, and some debts were also annulled as a bid to gain support. So undermining the Jewish community's richness and value was part of the politics of the time. And we can see this increasingly hostile approach in the next slide, which is another famous cartoon, this one of Norwich from the 1230s probably. And it shows one of Norwich's most powerful residents, Isaac Filjernet, a Jewish moneylender, property and dock owner, and a royal banker. Isaac employed Moshe Mocha and his wife Abigail to collect his debts, and this was obviously something they were very good at, because again, a clerk in the Exchequer has made this very hostile, mocking imagery, which reveals deep suspicion of what Jews were doing at the time, and lampoons the wealth and the allegiance of men like Isaac to the king. So as tax income declined and emigration reduced the Jewish population, the pressure on the Jewish community really forced people to go and live in other countries gradually over the century, the 13th century. The community was no longer indispensable to the crown in the way that it had been. And with increasing antagonism from the church and from religious orders and examples of forced expulsions that had happened around Europe before 1275, this next statute in 1275 shows a hardening of the king's attitude. So the next slide shows a copy of the text of this act. And by it, Jews were no longer able to lend money at interest. The tabular badge became compulsory. Royal permission was needed to sell property. A poll tax of 3 pence was demanded from every Jew over 12. Effectively, England's Jews had to live by other trades in an environment of increasing hostility from Christian merchants, at a time when the king was also plagued by rebellion in Wales and war with France. So the immediate routes to the expulsion of 1290 were this further hostility and widespread accusations of coin clipping, because many Jewish workers found it impossible to work in the ways that the new law demanded. Also important were the king's war debts and how they would be paid. King Edward looked to Italian bankers and not to English Jewish bankers to arrange loans, and he had to make concessions to Parliament before they would grant him a tax, and banishment of the Jews from England became part of that negotiation. And when it came, the expulsion was managed efficiently through those networks of officials I mentioned at the start. And in a little over 4 months, Jewish property and debts were seized and Jewish families were granted safe conduct, not always safe, obviously, to the ports with the goods they could carry. The final order, as shown in this final slide, a very small document, was recorded as routine business almost, even though it condemned a few thousand Jews that were left in England to a painful and uncertain future. Despite a community of converts residing in London and frequent Jewish visitors to England, it was another 365 years before a small community returned to London from Amsterdam. So the records in the archives help to tell this story. The themes of mistrust, ignorance, and jealousy are very familiar in the medieval period, as they are much more modern times. But there's more positive evidence. Much of it is routine, but it's crucial in itself because it shows how communities did work well together for long periods. So hopefully some of this will be picked up later, but now I'll pass back to Gillian.
Thank you very much, Sean. And it doesn't tell a pretty story at all. And it's good to be reminded through the treasure that you've brought to us today. I also noted that you talked about suffering a burden of heavy taxation for 200 years. That's a long time. It certainly was. So thank you, Sean, for sharing your treasure. And last but not least, I'm now going to turn over to Toby and invite Toby to share the treasure that he wants to.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm really delighted to be here today to give you a glimpse into the collections of the Wiener Holocaust Library. As Dawn suggested, the library has a huge amount of material that's useful for people researching the history of their families, especially those whose ancestors came to Britain as refugees. But our collection also preserves the memories of countless victims of the Holocaust and has a wider remit to help current and future generations understand how such terrible events could come to pass, and so close to home in an economically advanced country like Germany. And that's really what this item today helps us with. It certainly isn't something you would describe as a treasure. It's a shocking and a disturbing item, unique to our collections. It's important because it helps us to understand how ordinary Germans were encouraged by the Nazis to see Jews as less than human. The murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis in the space of just a few years after the creation of this game is an awful fact. But that's the reality that anyone looking at this object has to get to grips with. And what you're looking at here is a board game, which on first appearance looks very much like Monopoly or Ludo. Of course, when you look more closely, you can see it's very different from an ordinary board game. It's something that shows us how anti-Semitism was not only a feature of Hitler's speeches or Nazi party rallies, but something that reached into the domestic sphere and also began to shape the attitudes of children. That was, of course, one of the goals of Nazi propaganda. They wanted to control the minds of the young for the benefit of Hitler's regime. And among other things, what this game does, it reminds us that one of the first steps in any genocide is the dehumanization and isolation of minority groups. So as I said, this game is called Juden raus, Jews out. The object of the game was to collect as many Jews as possible in order to expel them from Germany. That's, in theory, was what it was. But in terms of how the game works, the player who collected 6 Jews fastest was declared the winner. This is really shockingly hateful, and it's perhaps worth pointing out that it would also have appeared so at the time to people living outside of Nazi Germany. And we know that because of an article that was published in an SS journal in December 1938, shortly after this game was released, which it actually condemns the game and says that it trivializes the efforts of the SS to resolve the Jewish question, and that it would be seized upon by people outside of Germany in an attempt to condemn the Nazi regime. And so it's interesting that one of the pieces of evidence we have about the game was actually the SS noting that outside of Germany this would have been shocking, and it of course is shocking to us today. If you look at this image, which is a close-up of the game, you can get more of an impression of what the game actually is and how it worked. So you can see the red figure on the right-hand side. This was the piece which players used to move around the board, and it actually represents a policeman. You can see there's a belt and a baton. So the player of this game was supposed to imagine themselves as a Nazi policeman rounding up Jews, and you can see the yellow cones have this kind of caricature of the Jew as a hate figure. And it's possibly not that clear on this picture, but you can see that the policeman is on a red circle, and these red circles were dotted across the board, and each of these red circles represents a Jewish shop. So, for example, on the left, you can see the name David, a family name. On the right, you can see Leder and Koffer, which are the German words for leather and suitcase. So each of those circles is supposed to represent a shop. Through playing the game, you were supposed to move around the city, rounding up Jews and taking them outside the city for expulsion. And in fact, by the time the game was released, thinking about December 1938, huge numbers, tens of thousands of Jewish men were being imprisoned in concentration camps across Germany, following the huge nationwide pogrom against Jews led by the government from the 9th of November, often known as Kristallnacht. Jewish property was also being seized on a large scale. Jewish shops were being smashed up. And the overall policy was to force Jews out of Germany. And perhaps if we revert to the previous slide, we can see on the board there's a man, a woman, and a boy who are shown with their belongings being forced out of Germany. And underneath that, it's not clear on this picture, but there's a text which says "Auf nach Palästina," away to Palestine. I think it's worth pointing out that actually the Nazis and other anti-Semites in Germany cared very little about where Jews should go, as long as they were forced out, and as long as so-called Aryans were able to help themselves to Jewish property. At this stage, before the Second World War, the Nazis had not yet developed the policy of extermination that would later lead to the establishment of the death camps. However, the last months of 1938 were an important milestone, and the violence of Kristallnacht was appalling, unprecedented, and shocking in its scale. So, talking about the purpose of the game, it was, of course, on the one hand, trying to teach young children anti-Semitic attitudes, as I've already suggested, but it was also intending to make money out of anti-Semitism. In the promotional material, and perhaps we can move to the next slide at this stage, the game is described as a new and outstandingly jolly party game for grown-ups and children. And, you know, the casualness of it is really quite disturbing. And just coming back to that piece of evidence about how the game was received in the journal written by the SS, they also refer to the fact that the makers of this game, a small company from Dresden called Günther, they were clearly, well, according to the SS, they were attempting to make money out of this game. And that was one of the things that the SS disapproved of, was the idea that the company was looking to make this a commercial success and therefore was trying to make the game appealing, when in fact the SS were more concerned about whether there would be international pressure for them to stop the very real persecution of the Jews that they were undertaking at the time. I just want to mention as I wrap up that the Wiener Holocaust Library has an extensive collection of Nazi propaganda for children, including this game. And a surprising number of those materials were using play in order to indoctrinate children. Sometimes this was racist and anti-Semitic. So we have, for example, a set of sliding paper discs that were meant to be used for playing a quiz. The answers in the quiz related to Nazi theories about the characteristics of different races, according to the Nazi pseudo-scientific race theory. Perhaps significantly in these discs, the Jewish race was not included at all. And I think that reflects the particular place that the Jews held in Nazi racist ideology, where they were seen as the ultimate enemy of the German people and earmarked in Nazi ideology for complete exclusion and eventually extermination. Another very disturbing item. We also have other propaganda games in our collection that are interesting from the point of view of how the Nazis tried to generate loyalty to the regime. For example, we have a wooden block game where children were encouraged to rearrange the letters of Hitler's name into the shape of a swastika. And also a Nazi card game which worked like Happy Families, where the players collected sets of photographs. One set of the photographs was 4 different photographs of Hitler playing with his dog, for example. The propaganda techniques of the Nazis were chilling in their sophistication, and I haven't shown pictures of these on this display, but that's partly to entice you to come to the library's website. We have an online exhibition about how the Nazis tried to inculcate racism and Nazi values into the young, and if you look at our website you'll be able to see images of the other objects that I described. So please do come and also find out more about the library and how it might be interesting for you and your family. And coming back to that issue of family history, I wanted to just show a couple of items that really more deserve the word gem. So if we could move on to the next photograph, perhaps one more along, it might be better to show. Yes, so this is one of the photographs of the children who were looked after in a place called Weir Courtney House in Lingfield in Surrey. And some of you may have seen the BBC drama, The Windermere Children. And for a period of time, the children that were looked after in this house were also looked after in Windermere. And we have some wonderful photographs from Weir Courtney House. And this is just one of them. And these children had been through terrible experiences. This photograph is of children who had been who had experienced and had been imprisoned in Theresienstadt ghetto. And they were looked after in Surrey in this wonderful institution. And I just want to mention the little boy on the left-hand side, who's now, I think he's about just turned 80. His name's Avigdor Cohnheim. And he approached us just this year, hoping that we could help him with his family history. And we did. We actually managed to find out a great deal from a huge digital archive that we have a copy of called the International Tracing Service Archive, which has over 100 million documents from the Nazi camps and ghettos. And what we were able to do for Avigdor, and the previous photo actually shows him as an adult, so we could just flip back to it. He's on the left-hand side of this photo. He had never really known anything about his father. His mother, quite understandably, considering what she had gone through, she was also imprisoned in Theresienstadt. She never mentioned anything about Avigdor's father. We now know through the research that we did at the library that Avigdor's father was deported to Auschwitz and murdered there. But his mother never mentioned anything really about his father. I think it was too painful for her. And Avigdor only really began looking into it much later in life, and we were able to find many, many documents. In fact, over 300 documents relating to Avigdor's father, and one of them actually had the only example of his father's handwriting. And I think that just goes to show that even now there's still so much to uncover about this history, and sometimes what we are able to uncover can be profoundly meaningful for people. So I would just really like to end on the note of showing those photos, just because it indicates that there are also heartwarming and beautiful gems in the library, as well as evidence of the hateful things that the Nazis did. So I do think that the Wiener Library itself is a hidden treasure, and I would very much urge you to come and visit. We also have temporary exhibitions. I don't want to sort of turn this into an advert for the library, but I hope that's given you a taste of the kind of material that we have in our.
It has. Thank you, Toby. And the word you used when you were talking about that board game is you talked about it being evidence of casualisation. And I think that is, I mean, everything about it is shocking, but that really, I think, probably strikes us all. So thank you very much. And I want to thank the panel, because actually it's been a wonderful contrast and really sort of acquainted us or reminded us with bits of history, which is very much part of our lives and very relevant today. So I'm going to start by putting some of the questions, and a reminder to our viewers, please do submit any questions via your chat function and we'll be pleased to put them. But I'm going to start with some questions from David Jacobs. So thank you very much, David, for a couple of questions which I think will get us going quite nicely. And I will come to Nigel first of all, so I'll give you a bit of warning. So always good to have warning, I would say. I would say, right, first of all, question from David. The first question is, he's asking, you know, we're talking about the written word and visuals, but what about the spoken word when it comes to
this
hidden
is an
treasures?
One. When I put the call out on our Facebook page, I got a message from someone I hadn't heard from 42 years. The last time I'd seen this lady was at my wedding, and she was involved in doing the disco then, and she said to me, you know, BBC TV did a programme called Close Up North, all about burdens, and if you come round, I'll give you a copy of it. And this was effectively a pirate copy that they'd kept because her father was on it. And it's like there are all these other archives there, and our task now is to go back to the BBC and say, can we legitimately have it, and can we have it on YouTube? And can we put it also in another Jewish archive so it's publicly available? So I think there's a lot of TV shorts, certainly in the north, that were done on Jewish things that only remain in people's memories, and they remember them because their family was in it. So there's a lot of material out there. It's just we've got to collate it rather than it just being forgotten or the old VHS tape that it was on disappearing. So there's a lot of material. It's just getting it together.
Thanks, Nigel. Toby, do you want to refer to this issue of spoken word as well as visual?
Yeah, it's interesting because when people hear the word library, they think of books, and I think people aren't necessarily aware that we have a really interesting, large set of collections of audio material at the library too. So I mentioned about the children who came to Weir Courtney in Lingfield, and there's actually an audio project that was done by Catherine Klinger, a researcher at the library, which spoke to the girls who came as orphans after the Second World War to Britain, and there's really long, extensive interviews with them. We also have an amazing audio project about a Polish town called Konin by a researcher called Theo Richmond, which is interviews with survivors from that town. And finally, it's just interesting to think about all of the different types of oral history projects. So it's not our collection, but we give access to an archive called the Fortunoff Archive, which is a really big project to speak to Holocaust survivors in the States. And it belongs to Yale University, but you can get access to it at the library. And the thing that was distinctive about their interview technique was that they asked survivors, they didn't do a kind of a structured interview with the narrative and questions, sort of where were you born, where did your story begin? Instead, they allowed the survivors to sort of talk in a free flow and for the conversation to go where the survivor wanted to take it. And so they're quite distinctive from, for example, the Shoah Foundation interviews. So even if you feel like you've listened to survivor testimonies before, actually the oral histories and the audio archives can often give you a completely fresh perspective.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up the other question from David Jacobs, and thank you for that one, and turn to Sean on this one. What advice would you give to baby boomers when downsizing in respect of their family histories and archives, which have been passed down through their families?
I think you have to be ruthless, because basically the volume that is really, really important is the material you'll want to keep hold of. And now obviously you can digitize before you store in a way you couldn't do before when you had to file papers. Just for example, the National Archives only takes about 4 to 5% of the paperwork generated by government. So we have to be ruthless in assessing what's really vital, what really shows the story you want to preserve forever. And I think that can be applied to family papers as well. I think you know your story and your family story, and you can possibly have a better sense of how you need to preserve the core information, the really vital material, and you can now digitize it and store it, and then possibly that's more appealing to a library and an archive as something to take in a digital form, which might then become part of a bigger story as well. So I think digitization and digital technologies helped us an awful lot in applying that ruthlessness, but in a more structured way, so that you can actually think about how these materials link together. And as digital archives are linking their catalogues too, you can perhaps see an easier route for putting your documents into a bigger collection. Thank you.
Toby, have you got any advice for any of us who are doing a bit of clearing out?
Well, yes, I would say that what Sean said about digitizing, I think that has changed things, and the library does encourage people to scan their material and to get in touch with us about it, and certainly not to throw things away. I think part of the challenge that we face is people don't always realize that the material they've got is historically significant. So they may think, oh, these are just a few letters, they're very personal. But actually, each of these stories sheds a very specific perspective on the past in terms of shedding light on it. And we would really welcome people, first of all, getting in touch, even if they're not sure whether it's something that an archive would want to keep. So our archivist, Howard, has been doing acquisitions at the library for over 20 years, so he's got a huge expertise in the subject matter, and he's very, very happy to provide advice and to look at some initial scans. It has been more challenging in recent months, but we really are concerned that might mean that some people or some collections might be more at risk than usual. So we would first of all urge people to hold on to what they've got and to not assume that it's not significant historically, because it probably is. And to get in touch with us about it, and we can help you make an assessment. And also, don't assume necessarily that we would insist on you giving the material to us. That we would also be able to advise you on more appropriate locations to store the material, or you may want to give us a digital copy and wait till later to deposit the original material. Those are all options. So the first thing to do is to get in touch.
Thank you. Many options, Nigel.
No, I'd agree with
Nigel, do we keep our stuff, or do we try and thin it out a bit?
I think it's an interesting one. There's a friend of mine. She'd lost her mum who'd come from Germany, and then her uncle, who was her father's brother, had also come from Germany, had died. And I went to see her, and she had a tremendous amount of material. And she had the problem that Toby had. How do you sort it all out? And my advice to her was, we have in the north, there's a Holocaust Centre at the University of Huddersfield. At least if you give it to them, the bits you don't want, they can search through. I do have a feeling now that people are finding more documents and are keeping them than they used to. Maybe 30 years ago, everyone used to throw everything away. Today, people are concerned about family history, and they do digitize it, and they put it and they share it. So I think there's more hope. And I think digitization has to be the way forward.
Yeah, good. Well, sound advice for us all when we're doing our clearing out, as a lot of people have done, of course, during lockdown. So we've really focused on that. I'd like to turn to a question from Agnes, and thank you very much for the question, Agnes. And this one's very much for Sean. First of all, a compliment. Dr. Cunningham's presentation was fascinating and eye-opening. And the question from Agnes is, were Jews regarded only as Jews before the expulsion, or as English people with Jewish faith? How were they seen?
It's a very good question, because it gets to the heart of the ideas of loyalty and allegiance, and then linking it through the church, because everyone in England who was Christian was linked to the Pope's authority in Rome, so beyond the King of England. Just the same, you could argue that the Jewish community needed that royal protection to be able to say, have that role in society that Christians weren't able to perform. So I think it was a double-edged thing for them. So they were protected by the king and allowed to practice their faith, but at some point the king would be able to exploit them for their wealth, and then we see lots of heavy taxation, as we mentioned before. And when that resource diminishes because of over exhaustion, really, the amounts paid over the 13th century reduced the viability of this royal protection, to the point where it was economically possible to expel the whole Jewish community. So I think they were not so much seen as a subject. Well, they were subjects of the king when they were in England, but they weren't. They were practicing because they were under that royal protection, and I think that was the key difference between them and everyone else. Because obviously, heresy in a Christian sense was anyone who didn't follow that very strict rule from Rome. So they would have been seen as heretical in the eyes of a lot of Christian theologians and bishops and that kind of thing. But in terms of the king's practical ownership of their resources, that gave them enough protection to have an identity which otherwise might have seemed incongruous and at odds with the rest of the country.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn back to the current issue that's occupying us now, the question of lockdown and the coronavirus situation in which we find ourselves. And a question which I would ask to all of you: archives have been closed for the last months. How's that affected you? How do you think that affects what we're doing in terms of our treasures? How do you think archives have responded to lockdown? So quite a lot of contemporary challenges that weren't anticipated. And I'll go first of all to Nigel.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing is the point you made earlier about people clearing out their own information, going through their cupboards, seeing what family papers there are. And maybe in the next few months when archives do reopen, it will be a boon for them when people say, I have all these papers that I want to put through. I'm constantly amazed at how much has been made digitally available. I know that at the moment we can't go to the archives, but even on Burton's, the amount of information I've been able to glean by contacting local people, using all sorts of other areas, I've been amazed at. So I think it's a two-edged thing. We haven't been able to visit the formal archives, but the last few months have got people clearing out and finding all sorts of things. And we have to say to them, if you found these wonderful things, as well as digitizing them, if you're not sure what to do with the actual copy, here are some archives who are willing to receive them. And maybe we should say if they're Jewish things or things of Jewish interest, these are particular archives that they should go into.
Thank you. Sean?
Yes, I think archives are under a lot of pressure anyway because of the resource issues in local authorities. And a lot of them who have been able to have done work to allow access digitally. So they might have taken down paywalls for digital content and allowed people to get access to things that they would normally only be able to see if they were in the archival building. I think we're conscious that a lot of people doing research are basically stalled if they haven't got a collection of digital images already that they can work on. So it has slowed down, say, students doing postgraduate research who need to look at archival material. And the National Archives, we've tried to make as much available for free as we can, but that's not always possible in other places. So we've tried to try and link people up and tried to use social media and forums to put people in touch with each other, try to get as much information out there to allow people to get over this period and not lose too much initiative and momentum. But it is tricky because now we're reopening on a very limited basis, maybe a couple of days a week in some places, maybe only very limited numbers of visitors with new social distancing rules, quarantining documents. So a lot of things have to be put into storage for longer periods than otherwise would happen. It's a new way of working. I think we're only just beginning to see how that's going to affect people. And it really is going to slow down the rate at which we can do research. So again, it might be another push for more digitization and more access through the internet. It might change the nature of how archives work for good.
Well, I guess archives aren't exempt and all of us are finding new ways of working. Toby, any comments about lockdown?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Sean and Nigel have said. I think they've covered most things, but I have noticed as well, it's been quite sad not to be able to engage in the same way with our volunteers. And I think volunteers are such a crucial part of the life of most archives, including ours. And we're now just getting to the point where volunteers can come back in and start working with the collections again. But it does remind me of the fact that, for many people, it is still quite a daunting thing to go into central London, which is where we're based. And I just hope that the lockdown doesn't reduce the momentum and the relationships that we have with our volunteers too much, and doesn't discourage other volunteers from putting themselves forward, because the contribution they make is immense. And then just in terms of us being a library, we have started doing a kind of a postal service for people wanting to borrow books published after 1980, which is something that many online bookshops are doing, and we're bringing that in from August onwards. So I think probably a lot of archives and libraries are just finding ways to adapt, and digitization, of course, is also crucial.
Thank you. To extend, because digitization keeps coming up, and I want to turn to a question from Winston Pickett, and thanks, Winston, for your question, who makes the point that the challenges of the digital age in terms of treasures and archiving are that people's memories aren't just physical memories, but may be contained, for example, in email and text and WhatsApp and all the other various means. I wonder what comment you've got about that, because they play such an important part in our lives now. So, sure.
Yes, I think this is really important because, again, it's where people's focus is shifting. And so the technology that enables big archives to capture this. So if we're doing it, say, for government departments, that's going to become the kind of software that can be shared because of the bigger picture here about capturing people's own stories, which are going to be presented in this format. So it's a slowly changing in terms of focus, but it's rapidly changing in terms of what technology can let us do. And we're having to deal with vast amounts of data and again, sift through it to work out what's important. but it has to be an issue that's addressed, because this is going to be an increasingly large chunk of how people record their life experiences going forward from now. It's still relatively new, but we're having to almost catch up to the way people are using it and the volume. So there's an awful lot of energy being spent in archives and in the archival sector to make this a really important aspect of archiving and creating collections in the future.
Before I turn to Toby to continue this discussion about text and email, I'm conscious that they say we take more photos than we've ever taken, but we look at them less because they're on our phones or on our iPads. So that strikes me as another challenge in terms of records, particularly as we've today been looking at treasures from yourselves, which have included what I call proper photographs. So, Toby, how do we respond to this?
Well, we have to upskill in a way in our teams, and it's now, I think, we understand at the library that everybody in the library team needs to have digital skills. And for the first time, I think it was 3 or so years ago, we were able to create a role of digital asset manager. So what that person, her name's Leah Sidebotham, she's been able to put together not only a way of us accessing and storing our material safely, but also advising people about the kinds of formats that they should be using. So, for example, when you're doing scans, if you might not be aware of the format or the size of the file really affecting the quality of it, and it's only really if you do a high quality TIFF that you've got a really good scan which you can zoom in on. And so people often need a bit of support with getting the scanning right. Is one example. But I also think we forget that these formats don't last for very long, and we already have quite a lot of digital material at the library which is in what we call legacy format, so old digital versions. So I suppose the thing that some people might remember is, VHS is one thing. We have things that are on sort of data tape, which was seen as the way to kind of keep things forever at one point. But now it's almost impossible to find machines that can read this data tape.
Or laser discs.
Yeah, I mean, the list really does.
I'm feeling really old listening to you, Toby.
But it's really terrible if that's the only version you've got of something. So we often do have to do this work to put things onto modern formats. But how long will they last? How long will these JPEGs and TIFFs be the thing that we create?
Yeah,
I'd like to come on that. I mean, I've had people bring me floppy disks and all sorts of other things. And it's also interesting when you see Facebook discussions, lots of communities have their own community page. And just as I raise things in Leeds, other colleagues raise things, and you get all sorts of replies and you get all sorts of images sent you. And then the question is, what do you do with it? You know, do you print it off? Do you save it? Or do you say to them, well, thank you very much, and sort of write a bit about it and then forget it and move on to the next project? And it is interesting. It was interesting, as Gillian mentioned, photographs. I have from 1978 to about 1995, photograph albums of all our holidays. After that, as things go digital, who knows where they are? They're all on little computer disks that somehow get lost. Big challenge. And I welcome any guidelines.
Yes, well, we should rue the day when the family slideshow came to an end, when we all had to sit around looking at endless slides. Oh, yes, it's ringing a bell. Sean, I've got a question for you in particular from Rebecca, who is asking about the National Archives at Kew. What different kinds of sources do the archives have for medieval Jewish history? And also, are they all in Latin or from a particular perspective, like a Christian perspective? So over to you, Sean, very particular one for you.
Certainly before 1290, they'll mainly be in Latin because they're created by the parts of government that were looking after whatever it is they're doing. So a lot of it will be financial and legal. So virtually every tax that the government put onto the Jewish community has got some sort of record of who was assessed and what they paid. The Jewish communities had their own court called the Exchequer of the Jews, and the pleadings in that court are where you see a lot more of the individual voices of the people who were using the court. And so you get Jewish women as widows who are carrying on trading, for example, appearing in their own right and offering statements to the court. And that's where you begin to see a slightly more personal collection. So yes, it's mainly administrative because it's the process that the government is going through to either look at something legally or investigate financial taxation. But in that process, it does collect a lot of information together. And another thing, that a lot of those contracts where you get the land deals and the business deals, a lot of them have come in much later when the Christian monasteries were dissolved by Henry VIII and their archives came into Crown hands. And you find a lot of much earlier material that was involved in land deals or other transactions coming in as part of that archive. So there's a kind of dog-leg jump before things arrive, which might be hundreds of years before the 1530s and 40s. And that's where we see a lot of these private deeds that wouldn't normally have any reason to come into Crown hands suddenly appearing in the Crown's archives. So again, you might get some petitions and things in Old French towards the end of Edward I's reign, but mainly government produced and mainly relating to government interests, but occasionally a voice will be seen. And I know Rebecca's done quite a lot of work on women and the law in the medieval period. So she's probably being quite nice to me there because I know she knows more about it than I do.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'm going to ask all of you this question. Have you noticed a growing interest in the history of Jews in Britain? And what is it that people are particularly interested in? And do you have a sense of why? So, Nigel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I get a tremendous amount of interest when I take walks. I get a lot of people who are of Jewish origin, who aren't Jewish themselves, but maybe their one parent or grandparent was, or someone came from Germany trying to find out about the past. And the other group of people are those people who worked for a lot of the large Jewish enterprises that used to exist in the north, many set up by refugees, who are interested to find out just a bit more about that community of Jews, which they heard so much about, but didn't know much about. So the answer is yes, a lot of interest.
Sean.
Yes, it's part of a really long story with this gap in the middle where there's still connections to what happened before, and then from the 1650s you get a different story and a different set of records, but in a way it's a continuation. So I think people are interested in that very long picture, and also you then can trace a lot more in detail. So I think that earlier period is becoming more interesting because it stands alone and its parallels to modern times are more obvious the deeper you dig into it. So I think as this investigation of minorities and different groups which are less well represented in archives in general, I think because of the role Jewish people had in the past, it's far easier to find those records that are going to tell these stories, and this is what the project is doing very well, is picking out key things as a hook to go and investigate much deeper. So I think this will grow as people become more aware of how expansive this story can be.
Thank you. Toby.
Yes, we've definitely noticed a growth in interest in the library's collections, and specifically with regard to the history of Jewish people during the Holocaust, and also Jewish life before the Holocaust in Germany, which is actually one of the richest seams in our collection. There's, I'm sure, lots of reasons for it. I think some of it is about family history and that the "who do you think you are" phenomenon. I think also it's generational, partly that. I think you've seen this also happen in Germany, that somehow the grandchildren have a particular way of relating to their grandparents, and that does suit archives in a way, because I've certainly spoken to many second generation children of survivors who have felt a real difficulty in emotion and an emotional weight when looking at documents, which is sometimes overwhelming. And I think possibly, I mean, this is a bit speculative, but I think possibly for grandchildren it's a little bit easier to go on that journey. I also think there is, sadly, in our particular case, it's in terms of the general public and their interest in our collections, I think it's also because we are living through such worrying times and we're seeing a resurgence in anti-Semitism, that people have many, many questions about this subject, which actually archives is one way of approaching them in a way that's kind of investigative and in a way that opens up the discussion and that people can feel comfortable to ask questions and explore. And I think that's one of the real sort of special qualities that archives have.
Thank you very much. And Toby, I'm going to come back to you for a brief answer on a question from Robert. Thank you, Robert, for your question. Robert, who says that he himself is a Hungarian Jew, reflects that the majority of UK Jewish organisations only seem to have material regarding Austrian and German Jews in respect of the Holocaust. Is there accessible archive material available, for example, regarding Hungarian Jews? Toby, what for you?
I'd say appearances can be deceptive, because it's true that the library has less about the experience of Hungarian Jews compared to German and Austrian Jews, and that's partly to do with its history. It was set up by German-speaking Jews, and that has helped. Well, it has shaped our collections. However, there is quite a lot if you know where to look in our stores. So we're quite lucky and blessed to our deputy director, Dr. Christine Schmidt, is a specialist in the history of the Holocaust in Hungary. And I would recommend that people who are looking for specific types of material do try and put in an inquiry so that we can help guide you to the relevant stuff. So with material relating to the Holocaust in Hungary, we have over 1,000 eyewitness accounts that were gathered in the 1950s, and a good proportion of those relate specifically to the Holocaust in Hungary. And although they were written and typed up in German, often the people who were dictating the material were the German speakers, and the survivors were Hungarian and Hungarian speakers. And they're now translated into English, so they are accessible. So that's one example, but it's far from being the only example. There is accessible material relating to the Holocaust in Hungary. It's just not maybe the easiest to find, but we can help you.
There you are, Robert. We can be helped. Great. So, unbelievably, we're coming towards the end of our time on this, which has been, for me, and I'm sure, judging by the comments, for our viewers and listeners, absolutely fascinating, as well as the opportunity to learn so much about our history. So I want to turn to each of the panelists to do a summary of the kind of things they've reflected from the conversation, and I'll come to Nigel first. And I'd also be grateful if you would include in your comments a reference to why you think that this Hidden Treasures initiative from the Board of Deputies is so timely and relevant at present. So, Nigel, over to you for your final words.
Well, I've enjoyed all the work I've done on this greatly. I think the Hidden Treasures has come at the right time, especially as Toby said, because lots of people are looking for roots now. And certainly where I sit in the north of England, a history that was for many years forgotten, the tailoring industry, for example, had gone. Now people are looking back at it and saying, what have we got left? What can we find from our family story? On the way up from, shall we say, manual workers to professionaldom, it was forgotten. But now is the time to go back and look at the roots, and a renewed challenge to look at how we get together some good Jewish archives for the Leeds and other communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll see you're getting fan mail, as you can see on the screen. And thank you very much to Winston for thanking our panelists for what they've done, and also saying it's a wonderful launch, as indeed it is for Hidden Treasures, and it's only just the beginning. So let me turn to Sean to wrap up how you feel about what we've been talking about and your view on Hidden Treasures.
I think it's really interesting to see how well connected things can become already from the discussion, how people have got their own archives, they know about things in their localities. You've got the national picture and also the international picture, and how everything can be joined up through records in collections. And obviously with the structures around how collections are put together, the interrogation and the work that archivists and librarians and researchers have already done to contextualize and ask questions of the sources before they're made available. I think archives are really important in telling that story and getting to the truth and presenting evidence which can be relied upon. So I think in that sense, this is very timely, because in a world which is going to change even more for us as Brexit comes in, and we see different changes in the country which perhaps we haven't looked for, being able to have this anchor in the stories of the past to inform the present and the future. And it's an old hackneyed saying, but basically that's why archives exist, so we can refer back to the way humans have behaved in the past towards each other and take something from that to inform what we do about our problems now. So I think that is what I've taken from this as a starting point, is that it's a really good way of collectively drawing all this expertise and experience together and creating something we can all rely on going forwards.
I certainly hope so, Sean. That would be a wonderful outcome. Toby.
Yeah, I would echo what's already been said, but I think in the digital age, we really see how much interest there is in history and in archives. And I think maybe for a long time it was assumed that archives are for specialists and archives are for academics. And I just think it's amazing over the past 10 to 15 years how archives have really flourished and become such public-facing institutions, and the internet has really helped with that. And I just really hope that continues, and I think that especially one of the wonderful things about the Hidden Treasures program is that some archives, I think, do still need more exposure, and also people often need a way in. People don't naturally, I think, know how to engage with archives, just if they've never encountered one before and if they've never been to one before. So an event like this, often all you need is a way in, and then you're hooked, and you're ready to keep exploring archives for the rest of your life.
Well, I'm sure it's quite clear to me you're all completely hooked, and I'm sure that all of us are also now completely hooked by archives. I really want to thank you all for your time and your expertise and the way in which you shared with us whatever it was that your treasure was. I think it really made it come alive. And in fact, that's what my takeaway is from this evening, that archives, I think the word archives, people often think they're dusty, fusty, and as you've said, often for academics. And I feel tonight, and this is the whole idea of the project from the Board of Deputies, Hidden Treasures, I feel we've now seen that archives are very much living and very important to us today. So I want to thank you all, and I would like to thank all of our viewers and listeners. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have, certainly by the fan mail as I'm seeing. Undoubtedly you have. And I want to reiterate my thanks to the Jewish Chronicle for being such a valued partner, and themselves, as we know, being a keeper of fantastic archives. And I would ask people, please look at our Hidden Treasures website, and you will find plenty there. This is the launch, this is the beginning, it is not the end. But thank you for joining us, and I wish everybody a very good evening, and thank you to all.